Well, this is the podcast from Multifaith Matters, and I am the host, John Moorhead. And today I am privileged to have Dr. Joshua Packard. I've been following his work for a while now. I find it fascinating, and hopefully folks who are listening and watching will as well. Dr. Joshua Packard is the Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute. Josh, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to chat.
I think this is the briefest bio I have ever used to introduce somebody. Can you tell us, do you want to tell us something more about,
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't know. Long bios are weird, right? Having people sort of read your life back to you every time you get introduced. So I have a PhD in sociology and really was drawn to applied sociology, which is a part of the field that takes the lessons that we've learned from lots of really great academic research over the years and tries to get them out of the academy and into people's hands that can actually use them. And so for me, that meant about 15 years as a professor, but really with trying to speak to an audience. When I wasn't teaching classes, my research was really focused on speaking to an audience outside of the academy. And so through the lens of sociology of religion, trying to understand and help people really understand what's going on with religion in America, especially what innovation looks like in those spaces, what even like the capacity is for new organizational forms, and what the sort of social dynamics are that impact religious spaces. And so wrap all that up and just concluded my time as a professor in May, and moved over to this research institute called Springtide Research Institute, and we focus solely on 13 to 25-year-olds. So the whole thing for us is trying to figure out where young people make meaning, where they're having conversations about life's biggest questions, and who's there with them, who's guiding them, what thoughts and ideas do they have about this, and how can we bring that out and help, as we say, help the people who care about young people to care better.
Well, I appreciate all of that, and we'll include in the program notes links to Springtide and your work so that folks can seek that out. But I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit more about that background that you're doing. Now, we're going to spend most of our time today talking about your current research in that demographic, but I wanted to begin with a question about the Duns, a group
Sure.
that many evangelicals probably aren't very much aware of. I came across a material on a website that says how religion drives people away from church but not from God, and I think that's a fascinating idea. In fact, I think we could even change that to say how church many times drives people away from church but not from God. And you wrote a book, Church Refugees: Sociologists Reveal Why People Are Done with Church but Not with Their Faith. Now, for evangelicals and other Christians who aren't aware of it, or who may be tempted to be dismissive, these are just folks who couldn't make it. They just wanted to follow their sin, this kind of thing. What kind of people are we talking about with the Duns?
Sure, good question. Well, I mean, first of all, you say that people aren't familiar with this, but like we wrote a book.
Right,
I
know.
Book, right? Yeah, we'd intentionally used that term on the website about religion as opposed to church, because we see this as a real social dynamic of a movement away from institutions generally. So while the book is, and that data, the data that's in Church Refugees is all comes from Protestant Christians, there's no particular reason to think that this is just confined to that sector of the religious, sort of universe or sphere. What we find, though, is that the Duns make up this really unique category. I mean, I expected to find much of what you just alluded to, which is I thought we were going to interview a whole bunch of people who, just couldn't. They really just wanted permission, to do whatever it was that they were inclined to do, and church was challenging them, religious teachings were challenging them to, not do some things, to be compliant with other things, etc. And they were just being selfish and wanted to move out. And I thought, well, it's still worth exploring because nobody else has.
Right.
And we were stunned to learn that that's not at all the case. What we found time and time again over the course of what ended up being like 130 interviews, hour-long plus interviews with people, is that the institutional structures and organizational dynamics that I think served the church really well for, maybe a century or so, maybe 50, 60, 70 years or more, are just really, they don't fit in a modern world, in a modern context, as well as they once did. And so the Duns increasingly are this group of people that really high performing, really dedicated, really, devoted to their faith and to doing what they feel to be God's work out in the world. And the church was just getting in the way of them doing it. And so they would go from church to church to church, and then ultimately decide that it wasn't them that was the problem, it was the structure that was the problem. And so then they would leave, but keep their faith intact. And sometimes they would leave, they would tell us that they left so they could keep their faith intact.
Haven't you said somewhere that these are some of the best and brightest many times in the church?
Yeah, I mean, congregations a lot of times, especially as memberships and budgets decline, increasingly become reliant on volunteers and lay workers to do a lot of the put in a lot of the sweat equity. Sometimes, everything from teaching Sunday school to cleaning the buildings to prepping before and after worship and leading fundraisers. So when those people get frustrated and leave, the consequences are different than somebody who's sort of sitting in the back of the consequences for your organization. I don't mean the consequences for what evangelicals might call kingdom work. I mean, every person matters. But the consequences on your organization when these really devoted and talented people walk out are significant. It has a trickle, I don't want to say trickle down effect, but like a trickle across effect. You end up, the small and dwindling paid staff ends up having to do more and getting burned out quicker. The people that provide a lot of the sort of vibrancy and life to a congregation, that are always the ones organizing the potlucks, or the ones you can absolutely count on to show up for the trash cleanup around the neighborhood, and all the things like it's amazing how really tenuous communities are. Even when we think that they're really flourishing, sociologically we understand that these can often be boiled down to like a community of 100 or 150 can be boiled down to like 5 or 6 or 7 key points in that sort of network diagram. When you lose 2 or 3 of those, things start to get on shaky ground real fast.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would encourage folks to pursue that topic more, particularly I just think pastors need to be aware of what's going on with various demographics in their congregation. And as somebody in evangelical leadership, I must admit I'm extremely sympathetic to the Duns. Sometimes I think my work is more appreciated outside of the walls of the church than within it. So it's a significant topic. But we'll shift gears to your current research. You mentioned, go ahead.
John, I'll tell you that we do. I was really pleased to be able to, as my time in academia was winding down, got to finish out one last project with a co-author. His name is Todd Ferguson. And as we were doing the research for church refugees, Ashley and I found just a whole bunch of people emailing us that were pastors saying, I'm done and I'm a pastor. Like we were like, we don't know what to do with this. We can't include them, in the regular sample because it would skew the data too much. So we set them aside, and then Todd and I ended up writing a whole book just about pastors who are done. It's called Stuck, and it'll come out on Fortress Press this spring. So there's like one more sort of follow up, and you'll be hearing, if you follow me on Twitter at Dr. Josh Packard, or look for Todd Ferguson, you'll see a lot more about it coming out in the spring.
Now, where are these former pastors going? Can you give us a little hint from them?
Yeah, well, stunningly, they're not all former pastors.
Right? Oh, okay.
Part of the story is that a lot of them are still in the, they're, in some cases they're like 5 years away from retirement. They don't really feel called to be a pastor anymore, but they feel like they owe it to their families to be able to, financially, put kids through college and pay for retirement and stuff. And they know they're reasonably good at the job, so they keep doing it. In some cases, they've left the pulpit and they're trying to find anything. I mean, part of it is the story about how we do credentialing and training in the American church. And, you get a degree, you get a master's degree that takes 3 years that isn't really transferable. And that's problematic. And pastors have a lot of times often translating the really significant leadership work that they've done inside of congregations outside of congregational life in a way that will matter to somebody who's making a hiring decision at a manager level or higher, and so a lot of them are struggling, looking for jobs. Some of them have made transitions, but it's really all over the place. It's one of the beautiful things about the analysis is that Todd, in addition to having a PhD in sociology from Baylor, has an MDiv from Duke and was a pastor for a while, and really brings a pastor's heart to understanding this group of people, and so the writing and analysis really flourishes because of that. So I was like, I collected the data, and then Todd was doing the writing, and I was like reading every page, like learning stuff myself. So I think people will find, hopefully congregations will understand their pastors a little bit better and what they might be going through.
Yeah, fascinating. I look forward to seeing that. Hopefully folks that read it if they're stuck, they can become unstuck, or realize they've got some other opportunities and places to go. Let's talk about your current research that you've been doing for a number of years. And you mentioned at the top of our conversation a particular demographic. Why are you focusing on those folks? Can you help unpack that demographic a little bit more? And where are they coming from in terms of religion and spirituality?
So it's the demographic that's, for now, known as Gen Z. So it's 13 to 25-year-olds. For Springtide, we'll always stay with that focus. So as Gen Z ages, we're going to stay focused right on 13 to 25. Whatever the next generation is, Alpha, I think is what some people are calling it. And we, most research institutes go down to 18. We think it's worth the extra time and resource expenditure to go down to 13. It is trickier to get that, to close that 5-year gap, but 13 is really at the age, for a lot of religious systems, it's the age of where rites of passage take place, confirmations, bar mitzvahs, etc. It's also the age at which young people really start sort of getting a chance to make their own choices in many cases. And maybe some of those choices aren't necessarily about, what my entire family is going to do in terms of religion, but choices about what they themselves are going to start to believe. And then on the upside, on the upper end of that age bracket at 25, it's as startling as this might be to some of the people listening, 25 is actually the age now at which social scientists say, okay, this is the age of adulthood. By 25, we find that we've got over half of young people who are living more or less on their own. Maybe cell phone bills are still being covered, but we tip that 50% mark that, at least pre-pandemic anyway, of young people living outside of the house and finishing up any sort of post high school education that they've done. So that's the reason for the focus. And we're not asking the same questions to 14-year-olds that we are to 24-year-olds. We're certainly nuancing those, but our concern really is that in that age group, it's something like 40 to 42, 43% of those young people that have no religious identification whatsoever. They fall into the nuns category. And what we kept seeing out in the field was a whole bunch of information about religion and even some information about religion and young people that was coming through a pretty narrow ideological lens. Either it was coming like from Baptists for Baptists about Baptists, or from Catholics for Catholics about Catholics. And that information was great, but when 40% of young people are not Baptist or Catholic or Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim, right? We need to understand the soul work that they are doing too. And somebody really needs to be paying attention to that. And I don't mean paying attention to it in the way that like Pew is paying attention to it and documenting it. And we certainly think that our data collection is nationally representative, it's rigorous. We care about the rigor just like Pew does, but we mean care about it in the way that we actually are trying to show up for young people every day. What can we do about that? What does an unaffiliated young person need from a trusted adult in their religious exploration? What does that look like? Who are they turning to? And so that's really those are the concerns that animate Springtide and sort of bring us to life, because the reality is far more complex than what I think most people would be sort of led to believe if all you were doing is reading Pew and Gallup statistics. Just because 40-some% of young people are unaffiliated does not mean that they don't care about God. They are very, very interested. And so we got to figure out a way outside of institutions to engage them in those conversations.
Well, how does the spiritual quest and experience and desires and things of this demographic, how does it differ from even the past generation?
Well, so for about 60 or so years, we've been undergoing this massive social transformation in America. And it's one that most people sort of feel, but probably don't have language for, because unless they're sociologists, they're probably not thinking about this stuff in a grand way all the time. And that transformation is really around institutional trust. And so that's the context within which young people especially are living their lives, which is this sort of drop off precipitously in terms of how much we trust public education, how much we trust politicians, how much we trust banks and big businesses and the medical system and religion. And trust rates for those things are not only really, really low, but they've been on the decline now for, like I said, half a century. Now, what makes so that's been going on. What makes this generation different, to get to the point of the question you asked, is that for the first time now, we've got a generation of young people being raised by parents who don't trust those institutions. And
Mm.
so, where a lot of church leaders will ask me, like, how do we get young people back to church? I'm like, you need to reframe that question. That's a 2005 question. The 2025 question is, how do you get young people to church? They're not going to come back. They never left it. They weren't there in the
Right.
first place. And that's really a significant shift.
Mm.
Even the last time that I taught my sociology and religion class, there were terms that I used to be able to say and use in the course of my class the first time I taught it in 2006, that I could just assume that everybody understood, whether they were religious or not. They understood broadly, like the concept of sacraments or communion or what a congregation was even. And by the time I taught it the last time, just about a year and a half ago, that was just, you couldn't assume those things anymore. Even something really basic like, the Abrahamic faiths all, are pointing to the same God and come out of the same tradition. That is news, to your average 18 to 22-year-old. So this is it is a distinct difference. We've crossed a point where not only are young people living in a world of massive distrust of social institutions, but that sense of distrust is not coming from a personal failing that they've experienced. It's coming because they're being raised by parents who are opting out of those things from the beginning.
What are some of the elements that make up the bigger cultural milieu that is helping to shape this quest? I mean, you mentioned distrust. I think most churches, most pastors are concerned about theology and worldview. If we just tell them why Jesus died and give them a flashy worship service or something that's relevant, whatever that means, but that's kind of the prescription. But it seems like there's a disconnect between what's going on culturally, sociologically, and so on. What broader currents in the culture should we be aware of?
So every fall we come out with a state of religion and young people. It's sort of a pulse check on where young people are that year with their faith lives. In fact, as we record this today, that's October 12th, our state of religion young people for 2021 will come out here in the next few days. And these are the exact things that we explore, because trying to understand the context, the sort of water that they're swimming in, is critical. It helps to explain why just getting better about your messaging and clearer about your theology with young people isn't enough. So, for example, when you grow up in a world full of institutional distrust, where that message is being reinforced at every turn, the first thing you need to do is some trust building work, not some messaging work. The data are pretty clear about this from State of Religion and Young People last year, where we put forth this model of relational authority that, if you lead with your expertise, in whatever way that is, either because you're so smart or because you have this title or because you have this institutional backing, if you lead with your expertise in a conversation with young people, they're going to shut you down immediately. It doesn't matter how right you are. So what happens is that they assume that when you're coming from a place of institutional expertise, and institutions can't be trusted, thus nothing that you say can be trusted. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So that becomes that points a way for a way forward for how we need to be engaging with young people relationally by listening and integrity and transparency and care. These are the other 4 dimensions of relational authority. And then once we do those things, then we get a chance to share our expertise. But when we come into this, which this is a really hard pill for me to swallow as a professor, I want to stand up in front of a room and tell my students, like, this is the way things are. I've studied this a lot. I know a lot about this. Here's what you need to know, and have them get excited and care about it just because I'm saying it. But that's just they're just not going to, until we, the old saying has never been more true, that they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
As I looked at some of what you've been releasing on Twitter and Facebook and these kinds of things lately, one of the things that just jumped out at me was this notion of faith unbundled. And I think it represents one of the greatest challenges for churches that I'll comment on after you describe it. What exactly is faith unbundled?
So yeah, great. So faith unbundled is that's the concept that we're exploring in this year's State of Religion and Young People. And it really emerged from this trying to understand the journey that young people are on as what tools are they using to help navigate all of this uncertainty that is normal in a young person's life, and now really heightened by the fact that, COVID is such a defining experience for them. And trying to figure out their way through an uncertain life without institutional connections and guides. They're cobbling together these different tools from different experts and sources and faith traditions. And I think, so Faith Unbundled, which, has as some of its key hallmarks like connection, curiosity, exploration, as sort of paramount virtues to that system. The best way that I've thought of, like the metaphor that I use to think about it is that, there's one version of faith transmission where it's like you sit down at a restaurant and a waiter brings you food and you can either choose to eat it or not eat it. That's your only point of agency, is you can either eat or not eat. And this is what I think faith looked like maybe for a lot of adults today when they were kids. Their parents told them this is the way it wasn't like you could have this or something else. It's like, this is it.
Right.
And then maybe there's this like messy middle ground where it looks more like you're ordering off of a menu, where it's like, oh, I've been exposed to some other religious systems within my tradition, or maybe some other traditions altogether, and I get to sort of pick, like I'm ordering off of a menu, like I can either be Jewish or Buddhist or Christian, right? Well, the best way to understand what young people are doing today is that it's more like a dinner party, like a potluck dinner party. They're showing up with other young people. They're exploring, they're taste testing, they're putting things together in weird like if you've ever been to a potluck, it's like the only place where you're gonna have like potato salad, and like a piece of steak and some shrimp. You know what I mean? Like
right.
you end up with this plate of everything that looks really interesting, but you wouldn't necessarily put them all together, but like, let's give it a try.
Yeah.
And also you're doing that in connection and community. So you get to hear all the stories about like why this person makes potato salad this way, and what's so important about this dish to my family, et cetera. And those become really rich and meaningful experiences. I think it's terrifying if you're a religious leader, unless you remember what it's like to be young. And if you remember what it's like to be young, that the person that you were dating at 15 is not likely the person that you ended up marrying. The faith that you had when you were 17 is probably not the faith you ended up with at 27 or 37. The major that you went into college with is probably not the major that you graduated with. So while I have some personal concerns about young people sort of taking these very intact and rich religious traditions and sort of, ripping them apart and assembling them back together again, then I remember like, oh, wait, like they're just exploring. They're trying to figure this out. And we can be there to help them do that, to guide them and walk alongside them without fear that, we have to correct every single thing, because the nature of being young is you're exploring, you're experimenting and trying new things. And, maybe we don't have to correct every single thing that we see to conform with the way that we understand the world. So that's Faith Unbundled in a nutshell.
Well, one of the reasons why I think this is so threatening for religious leaders, particularly Protestant, conservative Christian leaders, is because, as you know, there's great emphasis on belief, on orthodoxy, right belief, and they tend to follow this kind of bounded set mentality. You've got the insiders who have the right doctrine, and then you've got the outsiders who have it wrong. And they find this exploration, this journey process very threatening. If you're going to come in, if you're going to be a part, then you got to, this is what you have to believe. You have to believe A, B, C, and D. And if you're adding something else, then it's problematic. How can we help religious leaders, I don't know if relax is the right term, but be more comfortable with allowing young people to take the journey, even if it goes in places that we may not agree with and that make us uncomfortable, as we come alongside them in the spiritual journey?
I think you're absolutely right, John. Like this is exactly the concern that I hear all the time. And I really, really don't understand it. I mean, I understand it intellectually, like when somebody says it to me. But Christianity has this really amazing element of the Holy Spirit. And so like the need for Christian leaders to try and control every aspect, when a core part of their belief system is that there's somebody in control of the uncontrollable, or there's something in control of the uncontrollable. Like I have such a hard time reconciling that. The tighter you squeeze and hold on to it, I just keep like trying to look in between the fingers and the grip to figure out like, where's the Holy Spirit in that? Like where's the space even for that to happen? And so you have the answers, I think, right inside of this religious tradition that has this really lovely entity, this thing that takes care of that stuff. I understand people interpret that and what the role of the Holy Spirit is and the presence of it in lots of different ways, but it always strikes me as very odd. So that's the first thing I would say. Like, leave room for the Holy Spirit to do what is the Holy Spirit's to do, and understand that your job isn't to do everything. I mean, again, I don't want to stray too far out of our lane of social science and into the lane of theology.
Sure.
The second thing is, and this is speaking much more from a data and science driven perspective, is that I worked at camps. I've led young people through mountaintop experiences and encounters with the divine, and I did that when I was younger. I've seen what it can look like to get a commitment from a young person to a belief system, and I've seen what happens 3 months later. And the nature of those things, and because of the biology, the neurology of young people, they are inclined to see the world in black and white. They don't deal with cognitive dissonance better. I mean, these are all things that happen as your brain matures and gets older. So it's easier to get that sort of like proclamation of faith from a young person. And it helps us to go to bed at night feeling good about the work that we've done, when we can say like, oh yeah, I brought 5 young people to faith today, and like, okay, done with those 5, like, they've submitted their commitment, and we can move on to 5 more. It's like we put 5 in the win column, and you get to put your head on the pillow and feel pretty good about yourself. The reality is, and we know this from the data, we know this from lots of studies, is like, that's just not a durable, long-lasting sense of faith. And if it is, it's not because of that thing that you did with them in that exact moment. If it ends up being durable and long-lasting, it's because of the community that they're embedded in. It's because they have a sense of belonging. One of the things we write about this in Belonging, one of the oldest lessons from sociology is for any group, faith groups included, belonging comes before belief. And you can get these short-term wins with belief, but if you're not doing the community work, the accompaniment work, to use a Catholic term, the connection work, creating that sense of belonging to a larger tradition and a larger group, then the chances that mountaintop experience, that come to faith moment, is going to last are just exceedingly low. So I think it's how do we get more comfortable with that? Well, first of all, it's like, let's reframe into an accurate understanding of what is actually happening when a young person has a moment like that where they make a commitment. What we often think is happening is that we put one in the win column. What is actually happening is that they've taken a step. That is part of their journey too. We are kidding ourselves if we think that their journey ends there. It does not. Secondly, then, I think we've got resources and tools in our faith traditions to be okay, understanding that there's going to be some change and fluctuation there, and we can come alongside and as I say, like, the trick here is not to convince them, to give them an ultimatum that they'll say yes or no to that makes us feel better. The trick is to stay in the conversation with young people for as long as they'll let us be there. That's how you create a sense of belonging, undo this institutional distrust, and really move the needle when it comes to young people's faith.
Well, we've talked about the data and trying to unpack that to try and humanize it a little bit. Can you share a story or two about what the spiritual journey of a young person looks like today?
These are so we have this internal saying at Springtide that we don't want to be a bunch of old people studying young people. So that there's not much we can do about our side of that. We keep getting older. But one of the things, we have a number of things in that we do to make sure that young people's voices are informing our work, that we're listening, that we're sort of not fact checking, but interpretation checking with them of like, okay, this is the data, here's how we understand it. Is that how y'all understand it? And one of those is this young person's advisory board that we meet with. We call it our Springtide Ambassadors program. We meet with them every month. In fact, we get to meet again on Thursday night, a couple days from now, which I'm excited about. And it is fascinating. I mean, it's a diverse group of young people who sit down with us for an hour and a half every month. Sometimes we give them data points. Sometimes we're just having conversation. There's always an agenda spelled out ahead of time. So it's not unfocused conversation, but to listen to them talk about, I think of the story that we just heard a month or two ago. I can't remember exactly what it was, from a young person who told us that we're talking about the importance of presence and how important it is to really know and understand where somebody is from. And he said, like, one of my friends died in a drive-by shooting. And another one of my friends died in gang activity of a different kind. And I went to my priest and they told me to pray about it. I'm like, but my priest doesn't know my neighborhood. He doesn't know what kinds of things, like what is, he's like, what is prayer going to do for that? He's like, I'm not saying it's not part of the answer, but like, we need more or different than that. We need an understanding of like what somebody's really going through. And so this really put him into this place of like, well, there must be other resources out there besides my priest, and they have access to them. We all have access to them. It's called the internet. And so then he starts digging in online, looking at other support groups. People have been through things similar to him, looking for conversations that are happening around hashtags on TikTok and Twitter, and really finding a community of people who are trying to make sense of where God is in the midst of those things. And it's actually able to then drill down into like places online of people who are dealing with what he's dealt with from similar neighborhoods, if not the same neighborhood. So where his congregation wasn't able to do that, turning to social media, he's able to find it. That's fascinating, right? Like that is absolutely stunning. So ultimately this leads him down a path of belief that he's still trying to reconcile, trying to understand and unpack. But here's the thing, like we're always doing faith exploration with guides. The question is, who are those guides? And when young people were really connected to institutions, I think we knew who those guides were. They were youth leaders, they were campus ministers, they were pastors, imams, rabbis, like all the people that were designated to do this kind of work. Maybe sometimes families. But now when they're not connected to institutions, they're still looking for guides, and who knows? You know what I mean? Like who knows who those guides are? So what they said, what the young people in that conversation said is like, yeah, when adults dismiss what's going on for us, on social media and on the internet, like it sort of disqualifies them from the conversation in our lives, because yes, a lot of what we're going there for is like silly dances and great music and all kinds of art and like conversations with each other, but also we're doing this other work there too. And it has a tremendous faith impact. And so you can sort of see this sense of faith unbundled even emerging in that one story where, there's a disruptive event that calls into question this taken for granted system that he had been given. And, when he doesn't feel like the institution has even an understanding of who he is and can't be trusted to give him the right kind of advice, he starts looking to all kinds of other places to figure that out, and is in the process of figuring that out. So I think that's a pretty, that's a pretty typical, not everything is disruptive as a drive-by shooting or somebody dying in gang activity. I mean, sometimes those disruption stories can be just questions, some of the age-old questions about God. If he's all powerful and all good, how come X happens? And like institutions need to be better equipped to be in those exploration moments with young people.
Well, it sounds to me in listening to some of the data and where this demographic is at, that one of the more challenging jobs in the church is the contemporary youth minister. But I also fear that the job description that churches might have in mind is going to be fairly traditional. Yeah. And yet there's a whole new skill set and knowledge base that youth ministers and those who work with this demographic are going to need to grapple with. What suggestions would you have? What resources would you recommend for people who are stuck in this liminal space in the expectation of the church, and yet young people are coming at it from a very different perspective? If there's going to be any meaningful way of bringing the contemporary youth minister alongside so that they can really minister and listen to and empathize with young people.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I'll point to some of our own stuff. We've got this guide called The New Normal, which is these exercises in empathy to help adults understand what's going on with young people. It's a free download. So I'm pitching our own stuff, but you don't have to pay for it. You can go and sort of put yourself back in the headspace of young people as they come out of hopefully the pandemic and start to make sense of the world that is happening to them. We've also got a curriculum coming out about how to create belonging in your organization. But look, we've been collecting a lot of stories about what's working, because there's a lot of stuff that's actually working in various ministry settings to engage with young people. And regardless of the specifics, and we'll be trying to dig into this more in the coming years, but regardless of the specifics, they have some common things in mind. They have some things in common, rather. They are smaller. They are more relational. They are peer driven, but institutionally supported. And they're incredibly diverse and intersectional. And these are models that rely on the natural intersections that you already have with young people. This is almost all sort of in opposite to the big program party driven model that we've largely experienced in the Christian church here over the last 30 or 40 years. This notion of like, we're going to throw the biggest party we possibly can, we're going to invite you to it, and we're going to get to know you and, you know, foster a relationship there with you and for you. Even before COVID, where large gatherings obviously are now a very fraught place. We saw this, you know, social anxiety and other kinds of things leading us down this path where large gatherings and parties were not necessarily fun places for young people to be. You know, that was happening well before the pandemic. The things that we write about at Springtide are often really affirming for youth ministers and really challenging to people in positions of leadership. As youth ministers say, this is like ammunition to be able to take back to their bosses because they know this is the work that needs to be done. Like, this is the relationship based as opposed to the program based, the smaller, the more intentional. Like, they just need justification for doing that work, which is already where they see the most progress. And so I think that's, you know, a lot of what we're seeing in the data already resonates with the experiences of campus ministers and youth ministers, et cetera. But you're right. Much of what they're being asked to account for is based on these old models. And that's where things have to shift. We have to be just as innovative about relationships as we've been about programs for the last 30 years. And part of that means how we measure the impact of those relationships, the progress of those relationships, what are the goals of them. And we can't do everything. You've got, like, leadership is going to have to let you let go of some stuff. Maybe you throw a big back to school bash every year that still attracts, say, 150 or 200 kids or more. Maybe you let go of that because it takes 3 months to plan and publicize and, you know, get together. And what's the opportunity cost of doing that kind of thing when you could be taking 75 different kids to coffee during that same amount of time? No youth minister I've ever met has free time. They're not, you know, none of them are not working hard enough. They're all giving it everything they've got. So when we come along with data and frameworks like this that call for a different way of doing things, it has to come at the stopping of other things. And I get that. And that change takes time, but we can only, you know, all we can do on our end is faithfully tell the story of where the data are leading us. And that pathway is towards relationships.
Well, I'd like to be optimistic about this, but it is challenging. Are you seeing any churches reaching out to you saying, we're kind of getting a sense that there's something different and we don't understand the challenge? Can you come can you enlighten us and educate us?
Absolutely. I mean,
okay.
No, I'm optimistic about this too, because I've done some, because of COVID and not having to travel. I think I've done like 54 speaking engagements over the last 18 months. And a lot of those are in front of people who are doing youth ministry like at a grassroots level, like congregational based youth ministry, and to hear what they're doing and trying is really encouraging. At Springtide, you know, our position, and we see this in the data, that like young people who have well-considered religious lives are flourishing more than young people who don't have well-considered religious lives. And that's true even if that consideration at the moment of taking our survey leads them to say, like, yes, I've thought a lot about it and I don't want to affiliate with a religious entity. It's not the outcome. It's not the affiliation or the lack of affiliation that leads to their flourishing. It's the process of thinking about it and exploring it with a trusted adult. That's the thing that matters. And that's what we care about at Springtide, is connecting young people who have really deep questions with adults who really, really care about them. And, you know, I'm really encouraged by how much of that I see on a really like a weekly basis.
Is there anything I've missed, Josh, that you'd like to say as we bring this conversation to a close? Anything you'd like to say to the audience? We got conservative Christians, particularly evangelicals. And what we try and do here at Multifaith Matters at this podcast is model respectful conversations through difference and also make them aware of trends in religion that they need to be aware of and what's going on. Anything I've missed that you'd like to bring out?
Well, I'll just say in closing, you know, that it's certainly young people have potentially, especially across the country, as we look, you know, widely, they have a dizzying array of very diverse values and concerns, some of which may or may not line up with yours. But one of the things I've been really encouraged by, not just in the surveys, but in the interviews, we've done hundreds of interviews with young people, is that they're not asking you to compromise your values. They're willing to be in conversation with people that they fundamentally disagree with on key issues. And I think that's a really great place for starting a conversation. But now, whether the adults are willing to do that same thing with young people remains to be seen. But I've been really heartened by that they're not like, oh, there hasn't been this like, okay, you have to agree to these 8 things before we can even talk. They're interested in the conversation, they'll chat. And the other thing I'll say is we'd love to stay in touch. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Josh Packard, and we're at Springtide at springtideresearch.org.
Well, again, we'll include that information in the podcast notes so folks can access that. And I must let you know that I pre-ordered my copy.
Oh, great.
So I'm looking forward to, I looked at the PDF, but I've got to have the hard copy in the library.
Our designer does great work. It makes data really easy to read. So I'm excited to have the hard copy myself.
Yeah, it looks great. It is very readable. So we'll include a link so folks can pick up a copy of that as well. Again, my guest has been Dr. Joshua Packard. He's the executive director of Springtide Research Institute, and I would encourage folks to seek out the links in the podcast notes and follow him on Twitter. I think his research is incredibly important for those who want to understand and to interact meaningfully with contemporary young people in their current spiritual search. My thanks to my guest and to my listeners and to those who are watching on video. Until the next episode of Multifaith Matters.